Science. In our time, science, philosophy, and religion have come to represent three quite distinct intellectual enterprises. Each appeals for allegiance, not merely on the ground that it can answer fundamental questions, but also because of its contribution to human life and culture. In other periods, philosophy and religion competed for supremacy, though, as appears in the chapter on philosophy, some philosophers and theologians tried to remove this conflict by arguing for the complete compatibility of reason and faith. Nevertheless, before the 19th century, the issue, if one existed, was between philosophy and religion. Science had not yet become sufficiently distinct from philosophy to complicate the picture. When science and philosophy are not themselves sharply distinguished, men are not confronted with three separate claims upon their intellectual allegiance. Modern science, as something quite distinct in method and subject matter from traditional philosophy, may actually make its appearance as early as the 17th century, but not until Kant are two kinds of science plainly set apart. Not until then are they so defined that one becomes identified with what men have always called philosophy, and the other gradually appropriates the name of science and regards itself as a quite separate enterprise. Kant differentiates between the empirical and the rational sciences. This differentiation tends to correspond with the distinction by others before him of experimental and abstract philosophy. It also corresponds with a later division into the experimental or inductive and the philosophical or deductive sciences. But Kant does not seem to contemplate the possibility of conflict between science and philosophy, between the experimental study of nature and metaphysics, or what is for him the same, between empirical and rational physics. Hume is willing to admit only mathematics to the status of a rational science, capable of demonstrating its conclusions with certainty. He insists upon experimental reasoning in the study of nature, wherein only probable conclusions can be attained, but he does not make these critical points in terms of science versus philosophy. If the traditional metaphysics is to be rejected, it is not because it is philosophy rather than science, but because it represents a failure in philosophy or science, resulting from the wrong method of dealing with matters of fact. In the 19th century, however, Auguste Comte formulates a doctrine which, under the title of positive philosophy, explicitly declares that only the positive sciences, the study of natural, mental, and social phenomena by empirical methods, deserve to be called sciences in the eulogistic sense of that term. In contrast, philosophy is mere speculation, and religion is superstition. The word speculation is for the positivists only slightly less invidious than superstition. Whereas superstition implies irrational belief, speculation represents a futile attempt by reason to go behind the phenomena in order to discover ultimate causes or substances. This cannot result in anything but guesswork or conjecture. Never in knowledge or science, which are the same for the positivist. For all its show of logic and system, philosophy cannot produce conclusions which have the validity or objectivity of science, because it tries to do more than explore and describe the phenomena, and because it tries to do whatever it does without investigation or experiment. From many sources, in addition to Comte, similar views converge to form an attitude generally prevalent in the world today under the name of positivism. All its current varieties seem to have this much in common: the identification of science with knowledge of fact, and further, the restriction of such knowledge to whatever does not accord with this conception of science is either, like mathematics or logic, a purely formal discipline, or like philosophy and religion, it is conjecture, opinion, or belief, personal, subjective, even wishful. It seems appropriate that the most recent author in the set of the great books should provide us with a declaration of positivism, and that he should set science against philosophy and religion. It is also fitting that he should be a scientist in the field of psychology, since psychology is a latecomer among the disciplines which once branches of philosophy now claim to be positive sciences. Not only late, but last, according to Freud, for sociology, which deals with the behavior of man in society, can be nothing other than applied psychology, strictly speaking. Indeed, there are only two sciences: psychology, pure and applied, and natural science. In his new introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, Freud concludes with a statement of what he calls the scientific Weltanschauung. In essence, he thinks it asserts that there is no other source of knowledge of the universe but the intellectual manipulation of carefully verified observations. In fact, what is called research, and that no knowledge can obtain from revelation, intuition, or inspiration. Freud makes the drastic implications of this statement quite explicit. It is inadmissible to declare, he writes, that science is one field of human intellectual activity, and that religion and philosophy are others, at least as valuable, and that science has no business to interfere with the other two, that they all have an equal claim to truth, and that everyone is free to choose whence he shall draw his convictions, and in which he shall place his belief. Such an attitude, he goes on, is considered particularly respectable, tolerant, broad-minded, and free from narrow prejudices. Unfortunately, it is not tenable. It shares all the pernicious qualities of an entirely unscientific Weltanschauung. Weltanschauung, and in practice comes to much the same thing. The bare fact that truth cannot be tolerant and cannot admit compromise or limitations. That scientific research looks on the whole field of human activity as its own and must adopt an uncompromisingly critical attitude towards any other power that seeks to usurp any part of its province. As a threat to the dominion of science over man and society, religion alone is a really serious enemy. Philosophy, Freud thinks, has no immediate influence on the great majority of mankind, whereas religion is a tremendous force which exerts its power over the strongest emotions of human beings. Religion and science might be compatible if religion, offering men something incomparably more beautiful, more comforting, and more ennobling than anything that they could ever get from science, would only say, "It is a fact that I cannot give you what men commonly call truth. To obtain that, you must go to science." But religion cannot say that, Freud thinks, without losing all influence over the mass of mankind. And science cannot, on its side, yield at all in its claim to being the only avenue to truth, employing a method which carefully examines the trustworthiness of the sense perceptions on which it bases its conclusions, which provides itself with new perceptions not obtainable by everyday means, and which isolates the determinants of these new experiences by purposely varied experimentation. Science alone can arrive at correspondence with reality. It is this correspondence with the real external world we call truth. And thus, when religion claims that it can take the place of science, and that because it is beneficent and ennobling, it must therefore be true, that claim is, in fact, an encroachment, which, in the interests of everyone, should be resisted. Philosophy does not seem to Freud to offer men a genuine alternative to scientific truth. Unlike religion, it is not, in his view, necessarily opposed to science. At times it even behaves as if it were a science, and to some extent makes use of the same methods. But insofar as it parts company with science by clinging to the illusion that it can produce a complete and coherent picture of the universe, philosophy must be regarded as an impostor in the halls of knowledge. The picture philosophy tries to construct, Freud says, must needs fall to pieces with every new advance in our knowledge. Not itself knowledge, but mere opinion or speculation, philosophy does not, any more than religion, offer a substitute for science. Both together fall under Freud's interdict. Both together would be outcasts from human culture if what he calls our best hope for the future, that is, the intellect, the scientific spirit, reason, should in time establish a dictatorship over the human mind. William James, almost contemporary with Freud, also draws a sharp line between science and philosophy. Writing his Principles of Psychology at a time when the experimental methods of the natural sciences, especially physiology, have just been introduced into the study of mental phenomena, he is at pains to define the scope of psychology as a natural science and to separate the questions which can be properly considered by a scientist from those which belong to the philosopher. But unlike Freud, James does not seem to regard the philosopher as engaged in a futile effort to solve problems which are either insoluble or better left until science finds means for solving them. For James, and the distinction between science and philosophy does not seem to lie only in the methods they employ, though the empirical or experimental approach does have a bearing on the kind of problems scientists can undertake to solve and the conclusions they can reach. The problems and the conclusions are themselves characteristically different from those of the philosopher. The scientist describes the phenomena, according to James, as precisely as possible and as comprehensively, but without any implication of finality or totality. He recognizes that his descriptive formulations are tentative and incomplete, always subject to the discovery of new data or a more refined presentation of the evidence. Above all, he admits that he is only describing, not explaining, not laying bare the ultimate reality which gives phenomena their deepest intelligibility, or ascertaining the causes which show why, not merely how, things happen as they do. In the preface to his Principles, James says that he has kept close to the point of view of natural science throughout the book. This book, assuming that thoughts and feelings exist and are vehicles of knowledge, thereupon contends that psychology, when she has ascertained the empirical correlation of the various sorts of thought or feeling with definite conditions of the brain, can go no farther, that is, as a natural science. If she goes farther, she becomes metaphysical. All attempts to explain our phenomenally given thoughts as products of deeper lying entities are metaphysical. The scientific point of view, James admits, is anything but ultimate. The data assumed by psychology, just like those assumed by physics, must sometimes be overhauled. The effort to overhaul them clearly and thoroughly is metaphysics. James does not imply that metaphysics cannot perform her tasks well, but he does think that she spoils two good things when she injects herself into a natural science. Science and metaphysics should be kept quite separate, even though the sciences, in accumulating a mass of descriptive details, run into queries which only a metaphysics alive to the weight of her task can hope successfully to deal with. That will perhaps be centuries hence, and meanwhile the best mark of health that a science can show is the unfinished seeming front. The variance of James's conception of metaphysics and its future from other traditional views on that subject is discussed in the chapter on metaphysics. Here it is relevant to observe that James has conception of metaphysics and its future. No, wait. Here it is relevant to observe that James has a conception of science broad enough to include both the empirical natural sciences and what he calls the pure or a priori sciences of classification, logic, and mathematics. Yet, in his view, metaphysics does represent philosophy as opposed to science, because it aims at ultimate reality or underlying causes. For example, he rejects the theory of a soul, not because he knows it to be false, but because he thinks it has no place in a psychology which contents itself with verifiable laws, and which is to remain positivistic and non-metaphysical. James seems to embrace the positivist view prevalent in the 19th century and our own day. He limits science to, as well as excludes philosophy from, the domain of empirical knowledge. In discussing the possibility of free will, he says that psychology will be psychology and science as much as ever, as much and no more in this world, whether free will be true in it or not. Science, however, must be constantly reminded that her purposes are not the only purposes, and that the order of uniform causation, which she has use for and is therefore right in postulating, may be enveloped in a wider order in which she has no claims at all. Those modern scientists and philosophers who do not make a sharp distinction between science and philosophy, and who antedate any explicit formulation of the positivist doctrine, nevertheless do, for the most part, conceive natural science as experimental in its method, and as having for its goal the formulation of general laws describing and correlating the phenomena. They do not all exclude causes from the consideration of the natural scientist, nor do they all as stringently as James rule out explanation in favor of description or correlation. Furthermore, the almost universal emphasis by modern writers upon the experimental character of the natural sciences does not mean a universal identification of science with the experimental disciplines. Mathematics, for example, is usually regarded as a science in spite of its being non-experimental. For Locke and Hume, as well as for Descartes, it exhibits certain characteristics: the self-evidence of principles, the certainty of demonstrations, which makes it more genuinely worthy of the high name of science than are the tentative hypotheses and probable conclusions of experimental physics. Other disciplines are called sciences by comparison with mathematics rather than physics. Descartes, for instance, seems to think that metaphysics can as surely be made a science as mathematics can be. Locke argues that demonstration from axioms is not limited to the science of quantity. As much clarity and certainty is attainable in reasoning about moral matters, ethics is no less a science than mathematics. Hobbes appears to take a similar view of politics, though it must be noted in his case that he differs from Descartes and Locke, from Bacon and Hume, and others, in not distinguishing mathematics from physics with respect to the latter's need for experimental evidence. All the sciences are for him alike in being the demonstrations of consequences of one affirmation to another, regardless of the diversity of the matter. The certain and infallible sign that a man is a scientist in any field of subject matter is that he can demonstrate the truth, therefore, perspicuously to another. Hobbes, furthermore, seems to think that what is true of geometry is true of every science, namely that it must begin with definitions. In geometry, he says, men begin at setting the signification of their words, which settling the signification of their words, which settling of significations they call definitions. Without definitions, science is impossible. In the right definition of names, Hobbes maintains, lies the first use of speech, which is the acquisition of science, and in the wrong or no definitions lies the first abuse, from which proceed all false or senseless tenets. Not tenets, tenets. Freud expresses the opposite view, which is generally more characteristic of the attitude of the modern scientist, especially the experimentalist or empiricist in method. The view is often defended, he writes, that sciences should be built on clear and sharply defined basal concepts. But in actual fact, no science, not even the most exact, begins with such definitions. The true beginning of scientific activity, Freud holds, consists rather in describing phenomena and then proceeding to group, classify, and correlate them. Even at the stage of description, it is not possible to avoid applying certain abstract ideas to the material in hand. Ideas derived from various sources, and certainly not the fruit of new experience only. They must at first necessarily possess some measure of uncertainty. There can be no question of any clear limitation of their content. So long as they remain in this condition, we come to an understanding about their meaning by repeated references to the material of observation, from which we seem to have deduced our abstract ideas, but which is, in point of fact, subject to them. The basic concepts or definitions of a science are, according to Freud, in the nature of conventions, although, he adds, everything depends on their being chosen in no arbitrary manner, but determined by the important relations they have to the empirical material. It is only after more searching investigation of the field in question that we are able to formulate with increased clarity the scientific concepts underlying it. Then indeed it may be time to immure them in definitions. The progress of science, however, demands a certain elasticity even in these definitions. This may not be true of mathematical concepts or definitions, but Freud points out the science of physics illustrates the way in which even those basal concepts that are firmly established in the form of definitions are constantly being altered in their content. With the exception of Hobbes, the notion that scientific conclusions can be drawn from definitions or can be established without recourse to experiment is not usually extended by modern writers from mathematics and metaphysics to physics. As the chapter on physics shows, the basic division of the study of nature into philosophical and scientific physics becomes equivalent in modern times to a separation of the philosophy of nature from the experimental natural sciences. We shall return presently to that sense of science in which physics is associated with mathematics and metaphysics as a branch of theoretic philosophy, or as one of the speculative sciences. All three disciplines are thought of as proceeding in the same way, by the demonstration of conclusions from principles obtained by induction from experience. Ordinary sense experience, that is, not the special experiences artificially contrived in a laboratory under experimental conditions. But it should be observed that in the modern period, even those authors who use science in the foregoing sense when they discuss mathematics and metaphysics treat physics differently. They hold that physics must be experimental if it is to be scientific. In proportion as modern physics becomes more and more the model of science, the meaning of the word science tends to become reserved for experimental study, or at least for empirical investigation, so that non-experimental disciplines like metaphysics or ethics are questioned when they call themselves sciences. Other disciplines try to establish themselves as sciences by imitating physics. Marx, for example, in presenting his own work as economic science, seeks to explain how it can be scientific even if it is not experimental. The physicist, he writes, either observes physical phenomena where they occur in their most typical form and most free from disturbing influence, or wherever possible, he makes experiments under conditions that assure the occurrence of the phenomenon in its normality. If experiment in the strict sense is impossible in economics, at least the student of economics can be scientific in his effort to observe the phenomena in their most typical form. England, Marx thinks, offers the most typical example of the capitalist mode of production and the conditions of production and exchange corresponding to that mode. Hence, for scientific purposes, he has used England as the chief illustration in the development of his theoretical ideas. The experimental character of modern physics, whether it is called natural science or natural philosophy, is discussed in the chapter on physics. The distinction between the construction or use of experiments and the appeal to experience apart from experiment, either as a source or a test of scientific formulations, is discussed in the chapter on experience, as well as in the chapters on hypothesis and induction. Here it seems pertinent to note that neither the distinction between induction and deduction, nor the distinction between hypothesis and axioms unequivocally marks the line which separates science from philosophy. Aristotle and Bacon, for example, regard induction as the source of axioms in metaphysics or philosophia prima, as well as in physics or the philosophy of nature. They may have different theories of induction, but only insofar as one conceives induction as an intuitive generalization from ordinary sense experience, and the other makes induction the inference from experiments. Does the difference between them seem to have a bearing on the distinction between philosophy and science? Similarly, the difference between the scientists' and the philosophers' consideration of hypotheses seem to lie not in the role they play in reasoning or argument, but rather in their having or not having a special relation to experimentation, either to guide it or to submit to its test. Experiment, then, seems to be the distinguishing mark of science on the side of method, and, by an extension of meaning, even in those subject matters where experiments in the strict sense in laboratories with apparatus under controlled conditions are impossible. The scientist differs from the philosopher in an analogous point of method. The scientist investigates, does research, makes observations which go beyond the experiences which ordinary men have in the course of daily life. It seems to be in this spirit that Newton opens the Optics with the statement that my design in this book is not to explain the properties of light by hypotheses, but to propose and prove them by reason and experiments. In the same spirit, Faraday says of himself, as an experimentalist, I feel bound to let experiment guide me into any train of thought which it may justify, being satisfied that experiment, like analysis, must lead to strict truth if rightly interpreted, and believing also that it is in its nature far more suggestive of new trains of thought and new conditions of natural power. Lavoisier imposes upon himself the rule never to form any conclusion which is not an immediate consequence necessarily flowing from observation and experiment. Gilbert criticizes those who write about magnetism without recourse to experiments. Philosophers who are not themselves investigators and have no first-hand acquaintance with things. Referring to what has been hailed by the vulgar and by tradition concerning the motion of the heart and arteries, Harvey proposes to separate true from false opinions by dissection, multiplied experience, and accurate observation. Even a scientist like Fourier, who conceives physical theory as a kind of applied mathematics, says that no considerable progress can hereafter be made which is not founded on experiments. For mathematical analysis can deduce from general and simple phenomena that expressions of the laws of nature the expressions of the laws of nature, but the special application of these laws to very complex effects demands a long series of exact observations. Like Fourier, Galileo also combines mathematics and experiment in the study of nature. But though he is willing to introduce experiments where they are necessary in order to test rival hypotheses or alternative mathematical formulations of the laws of motion, he seems to express a preference for the rigor of purely mathematical physics. In the fourth day of the two new sciences discussing the parabolic path of projectiles, one person in the dialogue, Sagredo, says that the force of rigid demonstrations such as occur only in mathematics fills me with wonder and delight. The understanding thus derived, he adds, far outweighs the mere information obtained by the testimony of others, or even by repeated experiment. Agreeing with this, Salviati, another person in the dialogue, claims that the knowledge of a single fact acquired through a discovery of its causes prepares the mind to understand and ascertain other facts without need of recourse to experiment, precisely as in the present case, where by argumentation alone the author proves with certainty that the maximum range occurs when the elevation is 45 degrees. He thus demonstrates what has perhaps never been observed in experience, namely that of other shots, those which exceed or fall short of 45 degrees by equal amounts have equal ranges. That's something you learn in track and field when you're trying to throw a javelin as far as possible. The conception of science as consisting in a rigorous demonstration of conclusions from axioms, whether in mathematics or other subject matters, seems to be modern as well as ancient. It is found in Descartes and Spinoza, in Hobbes and Locke, as well as in Plato and Aristotle. Holding that science is in its entirety is true and evident cognition, Descartes may add that it has been mathematicians alone who have been able to succeed in making any demonstrations, that is to say, producing reasons which are evident and certain. Yet, he also hopes to make metaphysics a science after the model of mathematics. This conception of science is somewhat qualified by Descartes. When he discusses the study of nature, he tends toward experimentalism. Here he says that experiments become so much the more necessary the more one is advanced in knowledge, referring to particular effects which might be deduced from the principles in many different ways. He thinks that the only way to overcome the difficulty of discovering the principles on which the effects do depend is to try to find experiments of such a nature that their result is not the same if it has to be explained by one of the methods as it would be if explained by the other. On the other hand, the conception of science as knowledge founded upon experiment, or at least upon extended observation, seems to be ancient as well as modern. Aristotle criticizes those of his predecessors in physics whose explanation of the observations is not consistent with the observations. The test of principles in the knowledge of nature, he says, is the unimpeachable evidence of the senses as to each fact. It is for this reason that he praises the method of Democritus as scientific. Lack of experience, Aristotle writes, diminishes our power of taking a comprehensive view of the admitted facts. Hence, those who dwell in intimate association with nature and its phenomena grow more and more able to formulate as the foundations of their theories principles such as to admit of a wide and coherent development, while those whom devotion to abstract discussions has rendered unobservant of the facts are too ready to dogmatize on the basis of a few observations. The rival treatments of the subject now before us will serve to illustrate how great is the difference between a scientific and a dialectical method of inquiry. For whereas the Platonists argue that there must be atomic magnitudes, because otherwise the triangle will be more than one, Democritus would appear to have been convinced by arguments appropriate to the subject, i.e., drawn from the science of nature. There are many passages in which Aristotle rejects an astronomical hypothesis because it does not account for the observations, or favors one theory against all others because it alone seems to fit the sensible phenomena. So too, in his biological works, he makes experience the test of theories. Speaking of the generation of bees, for example, he says that if we ever learn the truth about this matter, credit must be given to observation rather than to theories, and to theories only if what they affirm agrees with the observed facts. And in his treatise on the motion of animals, he calls for reference to particulars in the world of sense, for with these in view we seek general theories, and with these we believe that general theories ought to harmonize. But Aristotle also defines science as the certain demonstration of universal and necessary conclusions from self-evident principles. Scientific knowledge, he writes, is judgment about things that are universal and necessary, and the conclusions of demonstration follow from first principles, for scientific knowledge involves apprehension of a rational ground. The emphasis here is on knowledge of causes and on the certainty and necessity of conclusions which can be demonstrated from axiomatic truths. By these criteria, metaphysics and mathematics are, in Aristotle's conception of the three philosophical sciences, perfect examples of scientific knowledge. Physics, as a general philosophy of nature, is also scientific knowledge in this sense. But the particular natural sciences, such as astronomy or zoology, are more empirical than philosophical in character. At least they involve admixtures of demonstration from principles with the verification of hypotheses by observation. To the extent that they are empirical, they are qualified by an uncertainty and a tentativeness in formulation which does not seem to be present in Aristotle's conception of the purely philosophical sciences. It might even be said that the knowledge of nature which depends on empirical research is not strictly scientific at all. Locke appears to say just that. How far, soever, human industry may advance, useful and experimental philosophy and physical things, he writes, scientifical will still be out of our reach. Holding that our knowledge of bodies is to be improved only by experience. Locke adds, I deny not but a man accustomed to rational and regular experiments shall be able to see farther into the nature of bodies and guess righter at their yet unknown properties than one that is a stranger to them. But yet, as I have said, this is but judgment and opinion, not knowledge and certainty. This way of getting and improving our knowledge in substances only by experience and history makes me suspect that natural philosophy is not capable of being made a science. Whether the experimental study of nature is the type of all scientific knowledge in its object, its method, and the character of its conclusions, or whether, according to another conception, the philosophical disciplines are the more perfect, perhaps even the only examples of science, there seems to be no question that different values attach to these two meanings of science, or as it is currently expressed, to science and philosophy. The philosophical sciences may be either theoretic or practical, according as they aim at wisdom or at action, but they are seldom praised as being useful productively. The practical sciences, which are also traditionally regarded as branches of moral philosophy, such as ethics, politics, and economics, may be knowledge put to use in the guidance of individual conduct or the affairs of society. But apart from poetics, which may direct production in the sphere of the fine arts, there does not seem to be any philosophical science or branch of philosophy that provides a mastery of matter or some control over nature. None has applications in the sphere of the useful arts. As indicated in the chapters on art, knowledge, and philosophy, Bacon appears to take a contrary view, using the word practical to mean productive rather than moral or civil. He divides the philosophy of nature into speculative and practical branches. He regards mechanics as the application of physics to useful purposes and finds a productive counterpart to metaphysics and what he calls magic. Nor is Bacon's point merely that the real and legitimate goal of the sciences is the endowment of human life with new inventions and riches. In opposition to those whom he criticizes for thinking that the contemplation of truth is more dignified and exalted than any utility or extent of effects. In addition, he thinks that the truth of science can be tested by its productive utility. That which is most useful in practice, he writes, is most correct in theory. Bacon's position with regard to the productive utility of science would not be contrary to the traditional view if by the philosophy of nature he meant science in the experimental rather than the philosophical sense. His emphasis upon experimentation in all parts of the study of nature suggests that that is the case. The fact that he places equal emphasis upon machinery and inventions and power over nature also suggests that technology is the other face of any science, which is experimental in method. Bacon and Descartes seem to be the first to perceive that knowledge which is experimental in origin must be by its very nature capable of technological applications. The instruments and apparatus which Bacon regards as necessary implements of science, no less than the machinery and inventions which science can be expected to produce, represent the very same techniques of operating upon nature. Experimental science is thus seen to be at once the creature and creator of technology. As Plato's Republic projects a society which cannot be realized unless it is ruled by the science of the philosopher, so Bacon's New Atlantis prophesies a civilization which the dominance of experimentalism and technology have brought to present reality. I was just thinking to myself just now, how human beings are an interesting species. In how we are constantly changing our environment into something different from before through the creation of technology. So that anybody who's born is like born into a different experience than previous centuries. It's like the nature of our existence is to constantly advance and build upon prior understanding. Seems to be no limit to how advanced mankind can become technologically. Just by building upon previous inventions and science. But I happen to believe that technology doesn't really benefit mankind. After a certain point, maybe. I think the scientist is the best product of science. I think it's people that are people in their development as individuals that's really important. And science seems to like just make everything easier for everybody. Technologically, which ironically results in people not developing as well as people who have to develop under conditions of difficulty. It is not in time that the race is progressive, or progresses. Meaning that we've regressed in certain times and progressed in other times. Just because we're most advanced now technologically doesn't mean that we're really better off than we ever were before. It's probably hard to define the perfect condition for a human being to exist in. But we seem to have certain... The soul seems to require conditions of difficulty. To develop. Not too difficult, though. And difficult in a certain way. I mean, you can do science for all eternity, but in the end, are you really going to be any closer to understanding how you came to be? Probably not. Probably more wise to just accept the fact that you can't explain it. Just roll with it. And that, to me, is why religion has so much weight. Because the prophets who have established religions, the holy men, the wise men, probably did just that, and mystified people. not to say science isn't a useful use of time. I think that's part of the joys of existing, being a lesser intelligence in a world created by a greater intelligence, is the pleasure of that comes from learning about it, about the world, how it works exactly. Seemingly infinite complexity to it. And it's all beautifully cohesive. It's probably why scientists are always so when they really discover something new and real, they feel like they're enamored by the majesty of it, of creation. The Fargo Deep Mine. Oh, there it is.